this video, we will look at court hierarchy in the United States. We care about the way our court system is structured because it influences how important a case may or may not be to our legal situation. By understanding the court hierarchy, we can understand what cases serve as precedent that are binding on us and which are only persuasive. The U.S. has two related but separate government systems. We have a national government called the federal government, and each individual state has their own state government. In this system, known as dual federalism, the federal government has specific governmental powers and the state governments have their own powers. There is also some overlap between the things federal and state governments do for their citizens. This dual system has a major impact on the legal system of the U.S. Primarily, this dual system also means that there are two separate legal systems operating at the same time. For example, we have federal laws and also individual state laws. So as a resident of the state of New York, you are bound by both federal laws and New York state laws. Our focus today is on the court structure within the federal system. The federal court system is administered by the national government and geographically covers the entire country. We call this simply federal courts. Then each state has its own system of courts with its own structure. While you will see commonalities in the structure of the federal court system and individual state structures, they can be very different. Let's take a look at the basic court structure that we use here in the U.S. Then we will compare that structure to the federal system. There are generally three court levels: the trial court, the intermediate appellate court, and the court of last resort. The trial court, very often called a district court, is where we first file an action. Then, if we need to appeal that decision, we will file in an intermediate appellate court. The court of last resort, often called the final appellate court, is the last court where we can file an appeal. In the federal system, we call the trial court the district court. For example, the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. There are many federal district courts, and there is at least one district court in every state. The intermediate appellate court is called the Circuit Court of Appeals. For example, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. There are 13 circuit courts. The court of last resort in the federal system is the Supreme Court of the United States. Appeals from each district court can only be filed in a specific circuit court. This is arranged geographically. Here is a map that shows us which states are located in which circuit courts of appeal. Let's zoom in on the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. This tells us that only appeals from the district courts that are located in New York, Connecticut, and Vermont can be filed in the Second Circuit. Decisions from all circuit courts can be appealed to the Supreme Court, but the court has discretion in selecting which cases it hears. This court structure not only tells us where to file, but it tells us which cases are binding on us. Binding cases or mandatory cases are judicial decisions that we must follow. When we start researching legal issues and reading cases, we want to focus first on binding cases that serve as precedent. Let's look again at our court structure, but now focus on this topic of binding cases. As we move from the Supreme Court down to the federal district courts, the cases are binding when they are in the direct line of jurisdiction. So in the federal system, decisions of the Supreme Court are binding on all lower courts. The decisions of circuit courts are binding on all the district courts within their circuit and only within their circuit. Let's use the Second Circuit and the Fifth Circuit as examples. If I live within the geographic jurisdiction of the Second Circuit, the cases that are binding are the Supreme Court and the Second Circuit. If I lived within the geographic jurisdiction of the Fifth Circuit, the cases that are binding are the Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit. You must be aware of what circuit you are in. In federal district courts at the lowest level, decisions are only binding on parties involved in the case. Remember, from top to bottom, cases are binding. If we look in any other direction in this structure, cases are persuasive. We do not have to adopt those rules. In practice, we may find decisions of other courts very persuasive to use or very strategically important to us, but they are not technically binding. Now we know more about the hierarchies of courts in the U.S. and can apply that knowledge to our search for cases.